Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
While America says its goodbyes this week to President Ronald Reagan, there's much deliberation over his administration, what Ronald Reagan, the man, has meant to America. That's what we're going to do here today, is to talk about on Public Affairs Roundtable just what President Ronald Reagan meant to American government, American politics, the American people. Our panelists are John Rouse, our executive producer, and a member of the political science faculty here at Ball State University. Bruce Galehood, a member of the history department at Ball State. Cecil Bohannon from economics. And George Pilcher, also from the history department here at Ball State. Generally, they say historians cannot judge the president immediately after he leaves office, that we need 15 or 20 years. George, are we going to take that long to judge Ronald Reagan? There seems to be a lot in the media now about his presidency already.
Well, I think we know enough about the past and enough about other presidents to make some preliminary judgments about Ronald Reagan, and some of those will be favorable and some will not be so favorable. And today, people will probably talk about his successes in foreign affairs, and I at least will talk about his failures in domestic affairs. But it seems to me that the most important thing he did was to restore the confidence of a large part of the American people in the presidency and in government after 3 decades of failed presidents.
He leaves office the most popular president leaving since Dwight Eisenhower in 1960. What does that tell us, Bruce?
It tells us 2 things. I think that the public has always supported Reagan in terms of the objectives of his intentions and what he has stated his intentions and the manner in which he proposes to go about them. He is perceived almost unanimously, as George pointed out, as a popular president, as a man whose interests lie in tune with what the people want, as an honest man, as a man who identifies well with the, shall we say, the aspirations of the ordinary citizen. But we also have to notice that those same public opinion polls that show him as a popular man, at the same time show a certain amount of degree, or a certain degree of suspicion and even unpopularity about the particular policies that he proposes, about the deficit, about the failure to address certain problems such as deficiencies perhaps in education or in child care, or policies for the poor, or the too large defense buildup sometimes are criticized. So you have this rather unique paradox of an individual who is personally popular, and yet his policies don't always command the same degree of popularity. I think it also shows why you could have a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan in 1984, and yet very, very small Republican gains in the House and in the Senate. A president who is very popular in 1986 and goes around in campaigns in Senate races for 10 Republican candidates, and only one of them manages to win in 1986. So obviously there is popularity directed toward the man. He is seen as a positive leader, but people will not necessarily take that popularity and transfer it over as it might relate to his policy objectives toward other Republican candidates or other people that he may be supporting.
Are we judging him as a better politician than an administrator, John?
Well, I think you have to put all this in context. The issue is not so much personality as it is the strong presidency, the strong president. There have only been essentially 4 strong presidents in this century. 1915, New Freedom, Woodrow Wilson. 1935, Franklin Roosevelt, Social Security, and many other things. 1965, Lyndon Johnson, civil rights, education, medical care. 1985, Ronald Reagan. So in our congressional presidential dilemma, there have been very few strong presidents. Ronald Reagan is a strong president. Point 2, I think you have to look in terms of the issues that we talk on this program from time to time, the marketplace of ideas. Mr. Reagan has been able to dominate, despite some of the things that despite the people who do not agree, he has been able to dominate successfully this marketplace of ideas. Let's ask the question, what values has President Reagan raised? What important values has he left with us?
For a guy who had watered down the Freedom of Information Act to say that he furthered the marketplace of ideas, I find incredible.
I want to pick a bone with the historians here, and I think it's a bias historians have. And it has to do with this way of judging whether a president is effective and what his place in history and all that is. The rap I'm hearing from historians in this program and also other places is that Ronald Reagan wasn't great on domestic policy. I'm wondering what the basis of that is. I think the basis of it is he didn't do anything. That is, there's no major program at a domestic level you can identify with Reagan. Yet it seems to me, for the large measure, the American people would agree that's the great accomplishment of the Reagan administration. The domestic claim that Ronald Reagan, the domestic legacy he's leaving behind, is he permanently changed the political agenda from how can we constrain government to how can we constrain government from what it was in the old days, which was how can we figure out some new program.
It does seem to me that one of the great purposes of government is to do things for the people which the people cannot do for themselves. And Ronald Reagan has left behind a happy middle class. He has left behind, it seems to me, a very unhappy and growing lower class. He has left behind a society in which racism is reemerging by all measurements. He's left behind a society which perhaps as many as 20% of all children live in poverty. He has left behind a society of massive governmental deficits which leave us no money to address the serious kinds of problems for which government was created.
George, I find it hard to accept the notion that if, let's say, the Reagan budget cuts or alleged Reagan budget cuts hadn't occurred, and let's say we'd spent $20 billion more over the 8-year period that Ronald Reagan was president on social programs in an attempt to ameliorate this problem with poverty. Do you really think the underlying poverty statistics in America would be any different?
I think one can argue that, yes.
I don't think they would be.
Because
I think the legacy of the Reagan administration, or the cause of poverty in the United States over the last 10 years or so, hasn't been policies that the government's pursued. It's been the microchip. It's been changes in the workplace and changes in the environment of the American economy that inevitably have had some consequences.
But you would disagree with even Ronald Reagan's pronouncements earlier on that it is government's appropriate role to provide a safety net for those members of the public caught in traps such as the microchip or economic change of whatever kind.
Let me come to George's defense here a little bit as a fellow historian. One of the most troubling statistics that jumps off the editorial pages at us recently is the one that says that there's a widening gap between the very rich and the very poor in the United States. And that's almost entirely a phenomenon of the last 8 years, the decade of the 1980s. Now, you know, this is a little dangerous for me to quote statistics to an economist, but this does seem to be a phenomenon of the Reagan years. And I'd like to maybe modify a little bit what George said about Reagan leaving a contented, happy middle class. I think he's leaving a reasonably happy, contented upper class, which has tended to do quite well as a result of the tax cuts that Reagan had. Now, that's to say that whereas it seems to me that the upper class, people making large sums of income every year, they are paying more in taxes in an aggregate sense than perhaps they were, but their percentages are different than what it would have been if those tax cuts had not occurred. But a lot of the gap, nevertheless, is widened between the very rich and the very poor in the United States. And I think that's probably going to be one thing that George Bush is going to be hit with in terms of an ideological discussion about the next, maybe the next year to 18 months to 2 years, and that is how can we more equalize the distribution of income in the United States between the very rich and the very poor.
I find it hard to, a good Republican like you, Bruce, saying that really surprises me. But if I think about it,
that's neither Republican nor Democratic. I'm simply saying that's been something that's been pointed out in the press repeatedly, and it seems to be somewhat, that's just undeniable. That fact of American economic life has happened during the Reagan presidency.
I think there's a lot of questions as to the statistics on this alleged increase in income inequality. But for a moment, let's accept the notion there has been increased income inequality. It seems to me to identify that with Ronald Reagan is like identifying Calvin Coolidge with jazz. I think of the 1920s and I think of Calvin Coolidge. The first thing that comes to my mind for some strange reason is jazz. Now, as far as I know, Calvin Coolidge never wrote any jazz, and he didn't have anything to do with jazz. I don't think he even liked it.
No.
Nevertheless, there's association there.
I've got to get back in this conversation. The purpose of this program, of course, is to argue the argument. We don't argue Republicans. We don't argue Democrats. It seems to me, however, that President Reagan has let the country run itself. However, at the same time, in a way, he's been a very Keynesian kind of Democrat. He's spent money. Deficits indicate that he's willing to spend money. He just spends money on different things than Democrats would spend money on, like defense.
Well, sure. If you look at the overall fraction of national income that's gone to government, it hasn't changed significantly under the Reagan administration. The only thing that's happened, that's right, it hasn't gone down.
That's right.
That's the point. The point is, all that's really happened under the Reagan legacy is a change in the agenda, in that if you have a popular, widespread tax cut for the entire population that affects most of the middle class, and you cannot rescind that tax cut, the government's immediately put in a kind of revenue-constrained revenue bind where they can't expand programs. Mm-hmm. And that's what Reagan's left behind, is we can't talk about massive new interventions on the part of the government with a $100 billion, $200 billion deficit.
One thing that will happen, though, and because of the tax cuts and the fact that the federal government has not had the resources that it normally would have had available, given the absence of the tax cuts, which helped to produce the deficit, which keeps money, at least at the federal level, tight, has been a devolution, if you will, of programs back to the states. And I think we've seen this over the last 5 years, that people are more and more looking to their state governments to supply some of the services that normally would have been passed through by federal revenue.
But the states don't do that. The states have
But the states have done that in some respects, at least by raising taxes. In the education area.
Some states have, but many states have not. And I would argue that the state of Indiana is a state which has not addressed that obligation, and I think there are many more states that refuse to pick up those obligations, and there are states who willingly undertake them.
But nevertheless, whether that's a failure or an achievement of the Reagan administration, that was something that was set out by Ronald Reagan to do early on. We're going to have a new federalism, and we're going to expect and hope that the states will do more to meet the needs, whatever, of their local, keep government close to the people in that respect. And whether it was to be done by tax cuts or depriving the federal government of revenues to expand its own programs, and the states therefore have to pick this up by default, whether that was an intention or design, I won't at least want to argue about, but that nevertheless has happened that way.
People are better off now, or do they just think they're better off now? I mean, is that what Ronald Reagan has accomplished, is leaving behind that impression that, yes, I'm better off now than I was 8 years ago?
Many people are better off. The upper middle class, and perhaps even the middle class. The people who vote are better off. The people who don't vote, poor people don't vote, children don't vote, they are not better off. Older people who vote at the highest level in American society have derived the greatest benefit from government programs. Children who generally occupy the poorest level in American society have reaped the least benefit from Reagan's programs. That's a legacy.
Not a pretty one.
Well, I again want to go back, and I'm just going to emphasize it time and time again. I guess it become the record that plays over. But I don't see how the federal role has had much to do with the underlying change in income distribution, to the extent you believe that's happened. If you look at the figures for total spending on food stamps, I was just looking through that a couple of days ago, and you discount it where price indexes, the real allocation of resources at the federal level to food stamps under the Reagan years has not gone down, it's gone up. Now, most people don't believe that. Most people have in the back of their mind there's these cruel Reagan budget cuts that have ignored the realities of poverty. I think all that's happened under the Reagan administration is you haven't had an expansion of the federal role in a time where the job market's becoming increasingly competitive and increasingly difficult to interact. I think the real problem with the poor in the United States is that the necessary skills to interact in the market have gone up in the last 10 years, and yet the quality of the education of the poor have gone down. And it's not surprising to see this major problem. But I think one's very hard-pressed to lay this on the doors of the White House.
Yeah, see, I think that's part of my point, because I'm not sure that the president has all that much power. He can be a good teacher. He could be a good preacher. And so in teaching and preaching, he is essentially talking about values. Does he focus upon obedience versus self-discipline? I would say that most of his focus has been upon obedience. Does he focus upon feeling as opposed to thinking? I'd say that his administration has been an administration of good feeling. So we have to ask, what kind of legacy will he leave in terms of what will he encourage us as citizens to? Is he, for example, going to encourage us to be better citizens? And in what ways will we be better citizens because Ronald Reagan was president of this country?
He has not used his bully pulpit.
That's the
He
point
has
I'm trying to
not
make.
used his bully pulpit to encourage the American public to address the real, serious social issues facing it, because he has chosen to willfully ignore those social problems.
For example, Bruce, in terms of drugs, in terms of obedience versus self-discipline, the line is just say no. Use the police, don't use education, don't go into the dynamics of drugs, but just go to the simplicity of it all. And so if you take an issue of racism, for example, he has been a passive president. A passive president. So the question again, what values will Ronald Reagan leave with us as Americans? How is he going to be our good teacher, our good preacher?
Well, how's he going to
I can't quarrel with what John is saying about the specifics of this, but I do have to challenge the assumption that the president may or may not have that much power. The president has tremendous amount of power. Maybe not to enact or not to have specific sorts of legislation enact, but I think, John, your comment helps to prove the point. The president has tremendous power in pushing that gigantic, monstrous federal bureaucracy in a direction. And Ronald Reagan has proposed to, and has chosen to push that monstrous bureaucracy in something of a conservative direction over the past 8 years. There's no question that he's pushed that direction of government different from what Nixon and Ford did, and certainly different from what Carter did in that respect. And there's no, with Lyndon Johnson, there's obviously no comparison. The direction of government has been pushed differently, and Reagan has done that. Now, if you want to talk about specific sorts of things to support that, specific sorts of programs, the fact that there's an absence of those programs helps, I think, to prove the point that he simply has wanted a greater degree of individual initiative, a greater degree of, so we say, individual enterprise on some of these sorts of things. And without contradicting anything that's been said, I would still maintain that the president has tremendous powers to make things happen. The best example I could cite would be in the area of foreign affairs. Who would have thought that the president who talked about the Soviet Union as the evil empire would be the president that would sit down and actually preside over an arms reduction treaty? You know, you wouldn't have thought that sort of thing would have been possible, that the two nations would have been so mutually antagonistic, especially after 1983 and the shooting down of the airliners and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, Reagan, in a pragmatic sort of way, has moved arms control policy, defense policy, and foreign policy in the direction of an accommodation.
Ronald Reagan will be remembered in 25 years for that. He will not be remembered in 25 years for the things he did not do, in all likelihood.
We never remember presidents for their failures. We almost always remember presidents only by their successes.
Unless it's a scandal. I mean,
unless it's a
remember
scandal
Nixon for Watergate forever.
That's right.
Oh, and Johnson for Vietnam. I think we remember that Johnson will always be associated in the public mind with the war in Vietnam, regardless of, you know, what your position is on that. People will associate Johnson with that.
And Hoover with the Depression.
And Hoover with the Depression.
Really, Reagan, in a way, is the antithesis of the three other presidents that I mentioned. Wilson, 1915, Roosevelt, 1935, Lyndon Johnson, 1965. He begins to question the role of government. The three previous ones attempt to use government in positive ways to solve the problems of society. Ronald Reagan believed otherwise.
Then Ronald Reagan will be remembered for one or two things in 25 years, maybe. Not the details that we know the week of or the week after he leaves office.
I think he'll be remembered for being a president that slowed the growth of federal spending and didn't initiate new policies in a way that was significant.
How can you say that, Cecil? I mean, you just said that the spending was the same as it was when he came in office.
But he slowed the growth of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's indisputable.
He put a cap on it because of the trick of turning the agenda to the deficit issue, okay, which will be remembered as being a nasty thing. At least right now, I don't think 20 years from now the deficit's going to be remembered as being a nasty issue. 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, why did we argue over that? Why was that something that was
Will
measured?
it be eliminated
The
then?
big thing that was occurring in the 1980s under the Reagan administration is by the deficit issue, you immediately put some constraint on the growth of government. Now, you didn't do what Reagan said he wanted to do, which was eliminate government. The rhetoric of the Reagan administration, here's where George and I will agree.
In his first inaugural, Cecil, he said he did not want to do away with government. He said he wanted to make government more effective.
Oh, sure, he said that, but he didn't want, but he also talked about in the 1980 campaign things like abolishing the Department of Education,
That's right.
abolishing the Department of Energy.
That's right.
All those kinds of things, which he didn't do.
He did make them ineffective, though.
So you're saying, in a sense, that Reagan has been a president who's not been a revolutionary. He's been a president who's an evolutionary president. I mean, he came in office as a revolutionary. He goes out of office as being very evolutionary.
He comes out of office essentially starting us where we started out from.
The Reagan years have been
Prove my point.
The Reagan years have been pretty good for Indiana, have they not?
Well, after all gets said and done, I think the legacy of the 80s in Indiana is going to be very interesting because in the early 80s, it looked like the state was going down the tubes. A lot of industry was declining. The big ticket items, steel industry, auto industry was in a decline. And by the end of the 80s, what do we have? We have a lot of other industries that have entered into the Indiana economy and are now much more significant than they were, let's say, in 1981. And the basic industries such as steel and automobiles being fairly healthy. So after all got said and done, I think the structure of the Indiana economy in the end of the 1980s is probably a lot better than it was in the end of the 1970s.
I still would maintain that probably the regions of the country that prospered the most under the Reagan presidency were the Sun Belt states. The states that could prosper from the defense buildup, that were oriented more toward the high-tech computer technology, computer usage sorts of things, service-related.
Right, from the expansion of the service industry. Now,
I don't know that necessarily we can talk about, the chicken and the egg on that. Would those sorts of things happen regardless of who would have been president?
Yeah,
And I suspect with the exception of the defense buildup, you would have seen states like California and states like Florida growing anyway because of the nature of their economies. But I think the defense buildup was especially crucial in some states in the South and in the Southwest. And they did benefit from these large defense contracts.
I think it definitely helped places like Southern California.
Absolutely.
But
New Mexico and Arizona.
Yeah. As we've talked about on this
Georgia.
program, though, the change that I think has occurred in the United States economy is manufacturing is not disappearing in the economy. It's being reformulated. It's being put in conjunction with the service industry. And after all gets said and done, I think manufacturing, which is in some sense a Midwest phenomenon, is still going to be very strong.
I'd be interested in a comment from my colleagues here as to whether you think Reagan is going to be remembered at all for the Iran-Contra scandal. Will this become part of the sort of the Reagan legacy, if you will, or will this just be simply a footnote?
It's already a footnote.
You think so?
Again, the influence of Reagan in terms of that legacy, a couple things. Number one, as George said, the ability to govern. I think that's very important. The second thing, in terms of his long-term impact, were with the people that he has appointed to head the various agencies, in terms of the regulatory agencies and also the courts.
But why do you say...
So in terms of the lasting impacts, the people he appointed to office over the regulatory agencies and the courts, and number one, his ability to govern.
But why do you say this ability to govern when you have a runaway deficit that nobody seems to be able to control, and you have the executive branch and you have the Congress, more or less, at the end of 8 years, throwing up their hands and saying, this is something that's just going to, it's got us all whipped. You know, it seems if there's any absence of real leadership, and I know that's what the prognosticators have said, a year or two into the Reagan years, well, you know, it was supposed to be an unmanageable job and it was supposed to destroy people, and yet Ronald Reagan has showed that he can still do it. But yet on just that one issue of controlling federal spending...
We have to talk about the judiciary, though, because that's the real Reagan legacy in positive terms. Is
ability to govern?
Is the judiciary. The fact that Ronald Reagan has appointed some 50% of the sitting federal judiciary, and presuming George Bush will be in office for 8 years or at least 4 years, that will be solidly composed of Republican appointees 8 years from now. And assuming that they apply the most minimal philosophical litmus test to these appointees, that's going to be very, very different. And those are, of course, the philosopher kings of the United
Thanks,
States.
George, but I got to answer Bruce. Bruce, President Reagan is the first president in my lifetime who really understands smoke and mirrors. I mean, he really understands how to govern and what he can do and what he cannot do.
Does he really?
Well, I think he improvises. I think, there's a certain amount of the Roosevelt experimenter in Ronald Reagan of trying some things, philosophically different, admittedly, but trying some things, seeing if they're working, and going from there. And obviously not getting overly concerned when something seems to fail. He does seem to be able to rise above those sorts of things. Let me back up, though. Something I said earlier in the program was wrong, that he has not been able to transfer his popularity over to other candidates. He did. He did very dramatically this year in the case of the presidential election, and was able to go into several critically large states and help George Bush deliver those states, which guaranteed him election. And that's the first time, since Martin Van Buren, that a sitting vice president has been elected to follow the term of a sitting president.
There wasn't
and that seems to be significant in a modern era, because a lot of people thought that was just very unlikely, that a vice president accumulates too much of the baggage of the outgoing administration, but not enough of the credit, and can't be elected in his own right as a result.
But what we're saying is that Ronald Reagan had obviously a lot of personal charm and charisma, still has a lot of personal charm and charisma.
Right.
Who can forget when he talked after the space shuttle exploded to everyone? I mean, that's what a president's supposed to do. But isn't part of what Bush did in the last election was figure out that's what he needed to do in order to get elected, and in fact turn the campaign towards doing that. That is, he developed his own personal, quote, charm or charisma to the extent that he could.
Well,
and what you had is, in September of that election, a whole change in the Bush image.
Right. He picked up on some of Reagan's themes, particularly the theme of experience in foreign affairs, and I think that worked to his credit. Now, it obviously was a negative campaign, and he had to resort to that, I suspect, in a way that Reagan did not have to in 1984.
But I know for myself, my impression of George Bush 1 year ago and my impression just sort of in my mind of George Bush now is very different, primarily because of the way he came off in the campaign.
I think
and so in that sense, what could we say the Reagan legacy also is to change politics more towards charisma, and say that's a necessary component now.
I disagree with that. I think it's always been there. I think that I think that you can put far too much emphasis on Reagan's influence in that past presidential campaign, given the state of the economy, the state of foreign affairs, and the state of psychological well-being in the United States. I think it would have been absolutely impossible for George Bush to have lost that election.
He went into several states that were toss-ups, and he left those states with Bush ahead by 3 to 6%. California, Illinois, Michigan, you can name them.
And then the
Pennsylvania.
Other hand, remember in August, Dukakis was ahead by 20 points.
At any rate, the Reagan years are ending, but the Reagan era has not. In fact, we have George Bush, in part, whatever influence Reagan had because of Ronald Reagan. So the era continues until we come to some catastrophic end.
In Ronald Reagan, you have the charismatic president, but charisma is not a good property because a charismatic person talks us into not thinking for ourselves. We start feeling, we don't think. Now, I believe what we have in George Bush is the professional president. Here is a man, in terms of his entire life, except for that campaign he ran, who has been a professional. His father was in politics. He has been schooled in terms of all the professional ways.
Reagan was not a professional?
No, he was not a professional.
He's been a professional politician since he ran for governor in California.
Well, he's a professional actor.
Well, we're not professional news
and very successful
television people, because we're out of time and we don't have everything we want to say. Thanks to John Rouse, Bruce Gale Hood, Cecil Bohannon, and George Pilch for being with us here today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.